Welcome to Clear Spoken English. Today we aim to help you practice English through stories. Let's dive into the thrilling world of Steve and the stolen delivery truck. Steve had started his day early, loading packages into his delivery truck and getting ready for a busy day. Inside the red truck were colorful parcels, large boxes, and deliveries that would brighten someone's day. Steve loved his job because every package he delivered brought a little joy into someone's life. His next stop was on the outskirts of the city in a quiet neighborhood. The streets were narrow, but Steve carefully navigated his way and parked the truck. He went to the back to retrieve a large package for delivery, but suddenly, with a loud thud, the back door slammed shut. Steve froze for a moment. "What's going on?" he thought, quickly reaching for the door. But before he could react, the truck began moving. The sudden jolt sent him stumbling forward, and he grabbed onto a package to steady himself as the vehicle picked up speed. This is a hijacking, he realized, panic rising in his chest. He could hear voices coming from the front of the truck. Two men were in the driver's seat, speaking rapidly and urgently. They were saying, "This truck is full of valuable stuff. Let's get it out of the city and unload it. We need to hurry before anyone notices." Steve's heart was racing. He tried to think clearly, but the panic was overwhelming. His phone was in the front cabin, making it impossible to call for help. He couldn't even use the truck's GPS to track his location. He was completely isolated, and every second felt like an eternity. "I need to get control of this situation," Steve thought. "I can't let them get away with this." He scanned the back of the truck, looking for anything he could use to defend himself. His eyes landed on a small metal rod lying among the scattered packages. It was heavy enough to use as a weapon. Steve pulled it free, gripping it tightly in his hands. The truck continued driving, its wheels humming against the road as Steve tried to steady his breathing. He heard the men talking in the front, their voices muffled by the walls of the truck. They seemed confident, but Steve wasn't going to make it easy for them. After a while, the truck slowed down and eventually came to a stop. Steve could hear the men jumping out of the truck, their boots thumping on the ground as they began unloading the boxes. They were in a hurry, and Steve could sense their desperation. Slowly, he pushed open the back door, trying to make as little noise as possible. He peeked outside, scanning the area. It was dark, and the warehouse they had parked in front of looked abandoned, with no one around to witness what was happening. As Steve carefully stepped out of the truck, his foot hit a large box, sending it tumbling to the ground with a loud crash. "There's someone here!" one of the men shouted. Steve's heart raced. He knew he had to act quickly. Without thinking, he lunged at one of the men, swinging the metal rod at his head. The man ducked just in time, and the rod missed him by inches. Steve barely had a moment to react before the other man rushed at him, grabbing his arm and trying to twist it behind his back. Steve gritted his teeth and struggled, but the man was strong. He could feel the pressure on his arm, but he wasn't about to give in. With a burst of strength, Steve managed to break free, spinning around to face his attackers. "You're not taking this truck," Steve growled, his eyes blazing with determination. The man with the knife stepped forward, a malicious smile on his face. "You're not leaving here alive," he said, brandishing the blade. Steve's heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He couldn't let this end in a fight to the death. With quick thinking, he ducked under the man's first strike, then grabbed the knife-wielding hand, twisting it behind his back until the man dropped the knife in pain. But before Steve could fully react, the second man lunged at him from the side, tackling him to the ground. The wind was knocked out of Steve as they hit the dirt, and for a moment, he couldn't catch his breath. The man's weight was pressing down on him, making it hard to move. Steve's mind raced. He knew he couldn't win a fight on the ground. With one powerful shove, Steve managed to knock the man off him, using all his strength. As the man scrambled to get up, Steve grabbed the discarded knife and used it to defend himself, holding it in front of him like a shield. The two men paused, realizing they had underestimated him. "This isn't over," Steve muttered through clenched teeth, his chest heaving with exertion. The man who had been holding the knife took a step back, his eyes narrowed with anger. But just as he made another move to lunge at Steve, something unexpected happened. A shadow moved behind Steve, catching both of the men's attention. For a moment, everything was still. The men turned to face the figure in the darkness. Steve, still clutching the knife, shifted slightly to see who or what was there. but it was hard to make out any details. The shadowy figure stepped forward, their voice calm but firm. "This isn't over, Steve." Steve's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this person was, but he didn't have time to wonder. Seizing the opportunity, Steve turned and dashed for the driver's seat of the truck. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. The truck roared to life and Steve slammed it into gear. He sped off, leaving the two men standing in the dark, watching him disappear into the night. But as Steve looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the shadowy figure moving toward the truck, their footsteps quick and determined. Steve gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the road ahead. His heart sank as he caught sight of the shadowy figure rapidly closing in through the rearview mirror. "Who is this guy? Why is he after me?" he wondered. But there was no time to think now. He pressed on the gas pedal, driving the truck faster, though the roads were narrow and winding. Danger lurked at every turn. The shadowy figure quickened his pace to catch up with the truck. When Steve saw him getting closer in the mirror, panic set in. "He's trying to stop me," he thought, anxiety gripping him. He swerved sharply around a bend, but the figure was relentless. Suddenly, Steve noticed the figure was armed. A gun glinted in his hand as he began to fire. Bang! Bang! The gunshots rang in Steve's ears. Bullets struck the side of the truck, puncturing the metal. Steve ducked instinctively, trying to shield himself. "Is this guy trying to kill me?" he thought, his heartbeat pounding like a drum. He floored the accelerator, pushing the truck to its limits, but the figure remained on his tail. Desperate, Steve racked his brain for a solution. "How can I stop this guy?" he muttered to himself. Then up ahead, he saw a bridge. Below it, a river rushed by with ferocious intensity. Steve devised a risky plan. "If I can get across this bridge, maybe I can lose him," he thought. He sped toward the bridge, the shadowy figure still firing at him. As the truck entered the bridge, Steve suddenly jerked the steering wheel, causing the truck's rear end to swerve dangerously close to the bridge's edge. The shadowy figure, caught off guard by the maneuver, lost his balance and stumbled. Seizing the moment, Steve drove the truck off the bridge and sped away. Looking back in his mirror, he saw the figure sprawled near the edge, his gun knocked to the ground. Breathing a sigh of relief, Steve muttered, "I think I lost him." But his relief was short-lived. Up ahead, several cars had blocked the road, creating an impassable barricade. Steve slammed on the brakes, but the truck was moving too fast to stop in time. "I need to find a way to avoid a crash," he thought. He yanked the steering wheel to the side, veering off the road and into the underbrush. The truck barreled through bushes and trees before slamming into a large tree, coming to a sudden halt. The impact threw Steve forward, his head colliding with the steering wheel. Dazed, he briefly blacked out. When he opened his eyes, his head was spinning. "Where am I?" he wondered. Surveying his surroundings, he noticed the truck was damaged, its engine dead. But the danger wasn't over. From the cars blocking the road, several men emerged and began approaching him. Steve didn't recognize them, but their intentions didn't seem friendly. "Are they after me too?" he thought. Deciding he couldn't stay in the truck, Steve opened the door and climbed out. Just then, a voice barked, "Stop right there! Don't move!" Steve turned toward the voice and saw a man approaching with a gun pointed at him. Panicked, Steve raised his hands. "You've got the wrong guy! I'm just a truck driver!" he shouted, but the men ignored him. "Unload the truck and hand over the packages," one of them ordered. Steve realized these men were thieves. "I won't give you this truck," he shouted back. The men continued closing in. Steve scanned his surroundings for a way out. His eyes fell on a rock on the ground. Acting quickly, he grabbed it and hurled it at one of the men, hitting him on the shoulder and knocking him back. Taking advantage of the moment, Steve took off running. The men pursued him, their shouts echoing in the forest as Steve dashed through the muddy terrain. He couldn't afford to slow down, even as his feet slipped and slid on the wet ground. Suddenly, Steve found himself at the edge of a cliff. He skidded to a stop, peering over the precipice at the river far below. "What now?" he thought. Turning back, he saw the men rapidly closing the distance. "I'm out of options," he realized. The men laughed as they saw him trapped. "Nowhere left to run! Surrender!" one of them yelled. Steve shut his eyes and took a deep breath. "Is this the end for me?" he wondered. Just then, a voice rang out. "Steve! Jump over here!" His eyes flew open, scanning for the source of the voice. Below the cliff, a boat floated on the river, and in it stood the shadowy figure. "Jump! It's your only chance to escape!" the figure shouted. Steve hesitated. "Is this guy trying to save me, or is this a trap?" he questioned. But when he glanced back at the advancing men, he realized he had no choice. "I've got to take the risk," he decided, and leaped off the cliff. As Steve plummeted, his heart pounded in his chest. He hit the cold water with a splash, the impact shocking his body. Struggling to the surface, he swam toward the boat. The shadowy figure reached out and pulled him aboard. Gasping for air, Steve looked at the man and asked, "Why are you helping me?" The shadowy figure removed his mask and looked at Steve. Steve's eyes widened in shock. The man standing before him looked just like him, but older, worn out, and with a hardened gaze. The man took a deep breath. "I couldn't fall into their hands again," he said. Steve was bewildered. How is this possible?" he stammered. The man gave a slight smile. "I am you, Steve, your future self. If you don't stop this gang, your life will change forever." Steve stared into the man's eyes, shaken. "What do I have to do?" he asked. The man pulled a map from his pocket and handed it to Steve. "This is their main hideout. If we don't stop them, everything will be ruined." Steve looked at the map, took a deep breath, and nodded. "All right, we'll do this together." The two of them set off down the river in the boat. Steve knew he was no longer alone, but this time, he was fighting to change his own fate. This story helped you improve your English listening and speaking skills. You learned words and expressions in context. You noticed natural fluency and pronunciation. You experienced English in a fun way through storytelling. Now try repeating some sentences out loud. This will improve your pronunciation and fluency. You've taken another step in your English journey. See you in the next story.